Blake McAllister began his day like most race days, with routine, focus, and a touch of superstition. He sat in the team trailer, the hum of the speedway in the background, sipping a cup of coffee while flipping through his pre-race notes. On the table lay a photograph of his wife and daughter, Emily and Clara, smiling at him as if to say, "Win one more for us." He kissed his fingers and tapped the photo, a ritual he hadn't skipped in years. "This one's for you," he muttered under his breath. It wasn't just another race. This was the last race before he planned to step away from NASCAR and trade in the roaring engines and blistering heat for quiet weekends at home. Clara had a piano recital coming up, and for once, he wouldn't miss it. The door to his trailer opened, and in stepped Rusty. Rusty is the team's lead mechanic, a rugged and resourceful man in his early 40s, with a quick wit and a penchant for tinkering. Years of working under the hoods of race cars had left his hands permanently grease-stained, his nails rough and battered. He's the kind of guy who could jerry-rig a solution to almost any problem, be it on the racetrack or bad night at the bar. With a streak of dry humor, Rusty keeps the team grounded, often lightening the tension with a sarcastic comment or a well-timed joke. Despite his tough exterior, he's deeply loyal and protective, treating the crew like family. "Blake, we're down a quarter turn on the rear suspension. You feel it out there?" Blake smiled. "Yeah, I felt it in the warm-ups. Fix it up. This car's got to handle like a dream today." Charlie followed, a headset dangling around his neck. Charlie is the team's longtime spotter, a wiry man in his late 30s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. Years of working in high-pressure environments have made him quick on his feet, both physically and mentally. Known for his sarcastic humor, Charlie often uses his wit to diffuse tense situations or rally the team when spirits are low. Despite his laid-back demeanor, he is fiercely loyal to Blake and the crew, always prioritizing their safety. "Weather looks good, track's dry, number 77's ready to dominate. Ready to make history?" Blake laughed. "Ready as I'll ever be." The hours leading up to the race blurred into a mix of interviews, team strategy meetings, and final checks. Blake focused on his usual pre-race calm, shutting out the noise of the outside world. Little did he know, by the end of the day, that world would cease to exist. The Bristol Motor Speedway hummed with life as Blake McAllister gripped the wheel of his number 77 car. The stadium, filled to capacity, echoed with the deafening cheers of fans, the rumble of engines, and the smell of burnt rubber. The race wasn't just a career milestone. It was a last hurrah before he planned to retire and spend more time with his family. He couldn't think about that now. The race was starting. Despite the roaring engines, summer heat, and the cheering of the crowd, Blake's mind was able to block it out. His mind quiet and his resolve steeled. The countdown began. "And they're off!" the announcer proclaimed excitedly. As the laps dwindled, Blake maintained focus, his car glued to the track. The roar of the crowd filled his ears, but something felt off. A brilliant flash erupted across the sky, brighter than any sun. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The engines, the cheers, even Blake's thoughts. The crowd gasped collectively, a wave of confusion rippling through the stadium. People shielded their eyes, pointing toward the horizon where the blinding light began to subside. Blake's heart raced as he lifted his visor to glance at the stands. Drivers ahead of him slowed, unsure of what to do, their cars coasting like startled animals. "The hell is that?" came a voice over the radio, static crackling through the line. Blake instinctively hit the brakes, adrenaline surging as he tried to process the unnatural sight. 10 seconds stretched into an eternity as the drivers and spectators stared, frozen by the surreal spectacle. A mushroom cloud in the distance. Then, the shockwave came. Blake instinctively hit the brakes, but the shockwave hit moments later. Cars spun out of control and debris rained down. The thunderous roar wasn't from the engines. It was the world breaking apart. When Blake came to, the roar was replaced by an eerie silence. He pried himself out of the crumpled wreckage of his car. Around him, smoke and ash blotted the sky. Fans and pit crew were sprawled across the stands and track, some moving, most not. "Charlie! Rusty!" he shouted, his voice cracking. Charlie, his longtime spotter, staggered toward him, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. Rusty, the crew's mechanic, emerged from under the wreckage of the pit box, coughing, but alive. "What the hell just happened?" Rusty gasped. "Something bad," Blake muttered, surveying the horizon. In the distance, a mushroom cloud rose, its billowing plume a harbinger of the end. The trio gathered what they could from the remains of the speedway: water bottles, energy bars, and a first aid kit. Blake couldn't shake the image of his wife and daughter. They had stayed home, far from the track. But how far was enough? "We need to move," Charlie said, his usual humor replaced by grim determination. Rusty nodded, grabbing a toolbox. "If we're lucky, we'll find a working vehicle." They trudged toward the parking lot, but the scene outside the speedway was even worse. Buildings were flattened, cars flipped, and a thick layer of ash coated everything. They eventually found a pickup truck that Rusty managed to hotwire. As they drove through the ruins of Bristol, the truck's radio crackled. Snippets of static Latin broadcasts broke through. "Underground shelter. Survivors. East of the Appalachians. Did you hear that?" Charlie asked, his voice tinged with hope. "East," Blake said, gripping the wheel. "We head east. Man, this road looks like something out of a nightmare, Charlie said, peering out the cracked windshield as the truck bounced along the broken pavement. Above them, the sky churned with ash-gray clouds and followed, drifted down like ghostly snowflakes. The particles clung to everything, softening the jagged edges of the ruins, but coating the air with an acrid taste. Blake tightened his grip on the steering wheel. It exists. It has to. Rusty, sitting in the back seat, brushed fallout off his jacket and frowned. Feels like the sky's dumping poison on us. You sure this truck can take us much further? It's taken us as far as it can, Blake replied. The truck's tires crunched over debris, kicking up small clouds of ash with every turn. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of their radio or the low groan of shifting metal in the distance. You started to sound like one of those conspiracy nuts, McAllisters. Shelters, underground bunkers, the whole works. Next, you're gonna tell us Bigfoot's manning the gates, Rusty added with a weak grin. Blake shot him a glance in the rearview mirror, a faint smirk creeping onto his face. If Bigfoot lets us in, I'll buy him a drink. The humor broke the tension momentarily, but it didn't last long. The ruins of the city loomed around them, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, their jagged edges silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the ash-laden sky. Fallout clung to rusted vehicles and twisted lampposts, muting their colors to a uniform gray. Stop the truck, Rusty said, leaning forward. Blake hit the brakes, the truck lurching to a halt. What is it? Rusty pointed ahead. Gas station. Might be worth a look. Charlie squinted to the grime-covered windshield. Or a trap. You know these places attract desperate people. Desperate's what we are, Rusty countered, opening the door. I'll check it out. Not alone, Blake said, stepping out after him. Charlie sighed but followed, the trio moving cautiously towards the dilapidated station. Fallout crunched beneath their boots as they walked, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. Inside, the shelves were mostly bare, but Rusty rummaged behind the counter and emerged, holding a dusty crate of canned goods. Jackpot, he declared, grinning. Look, soup! And some peaches! Blake's radio crackled faintly from the truck, static giving way to fragmented words. Survivors, coordinates, east, shelter. Charlie's eyes widened. That's the clearest transmission we've gotten. East it is. Rusty looked at the cans in his hands. Let's load up and get moving. This place gives me the creeps. As they packed the truck, the ash thickened, blanketing the ground in a powdery gray sheet. A distant sound reached them, a low rumble followed by faint shouts. Blake froze. We're not alone. Time to go, Charlie barked, scrambling into the passenger seat. Rusty jumped into the back as Blake floored it. In the rearview mirror, a group of figures emerged from the shadows, running after them. You think they wanted to say hi? Rusty quipped, his grin strained. I'm not stopping to find out, Blake muttered, his focus on the road ahead. The truck sped away, leaving the gas station and its dangers behind. The journey continued, but the tension hung heavier than ever. Every mile brought them closer to the shelter, and whatever awaited them there. The journey east was treacherous. Highways were clogged with abandoned cars. Bridges were either destroyed or unstable. They stuck to back roads, navigating through shattered towns and eerily silent forests. The truck became their lifeline, a lifeline that many others wished they could have, that many others wanted. They had to constantly be on the move. One part out of necessity to get to the shelter, and the other for fear of their truck being stolen. Or worse. You think they made it? Charlie asked one night as they camped by the roadside. They had to, Blake replied, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring Charlie or himself. They passed through towns where survivors stared at them with hollow eyes, too weak or too wary to approach. One day, they encountered a small group of armed men who emerged from the shadows of a derelict building. The leader, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, raised his rifle and barked, Nice truck. Bet it's got supplies. Hand them over and no one gets hurt. Blake's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. What do we do? Charlie whispered, eyes darting between the armed men and the ash-covered street ahead. Rusty leaned forward. We're not giving them anything. This truck's all we got. The scarred man cocked his head, his voice dripping with mock patience. Last chance. Supplies or we take them ourselves. Blake's pulse pounded as he weighed their options. Fighting wasn't one of them. They were outgunned. Hold on, he muttered, shifting the truck into gear. The silence stretched, each second a taut thread ready to snap. Then Blake slammed his foot on the gas. The truck roared forward, tires spitting ash and gravel as it hurtled towards the men. The scarred leader shouted, raising his weapon, but Blake didn't look back. Shots rang out, the rearview mirror shattering as bullets struck the vehicle. One grazed the truck's side, leaving a jagged streak across the metal. Go, go! Charlie shouted, gripping the dashboard as they barreled past the blockade. Rusty ducked, cursing as more shots ricocheted off the truck's frame. In the chaos, one of the armed men lunged at the vehicle, his hand slamming against the door before he stumbled back, swallowed by the dust. The gunfire grew distant as they sped down the road. Blake's hands steady on the wheel, despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. When they were miles away, he finally eased off the gas, the truck's engine sputtering as it caught its breath. Charlie exhaled shakily. Think they followed us? Rusty leaned back, his face pale but determined. Let 'em try. Next time, remind me to carry something bigger than a wrench. Blake didn't respond. his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The encounter had shaken them, but it was a harsh reminder. The world wasn't just dying, it was turning hostile. It had been 9 days since the bombs fell. A trip that should have taken less than 24 hours was a nightmare of backtracking, detours, and the occasional off-roading. The group's health began to deteriorate. Rusty, Charlie, and even Blake started to show the telltale signs of radiation sickness. Persistent coughs, nausea, and a weariness that weighed down with every step. Charlie scratched at the faint rash spreading along his arms, while Blake's joints ached with every movement. Rusty's energy ebbed, but no more than theirs. They were all fighting the same invisible poison that clung to the air, the food, and the water. They pushed eastward, each struggling against their failing bodies as the symptoms worsened. They scavenged when they could, relying on streams that Rusty tried to filter with scraps of cloth and by boiling, and by eating cans of tinned food they hoped wasn't contaminated. They took turns driving the truck, though even sitting upright for long stretches became a trial. Despite their hardships, the crackling transmissions from the radio offered a glimmer of hope. The group cruised slowly through another desolate small town. Trash and broken down vehicles littered the streets. The windows of the town square were a mix of shattered and boarded up. They made it 3 miles out of the town before making a turn off the main road onto a dirt one. The group stirred as Blake shouted, "This is it!" as barbed wire fences came into view. The entrance to the shelter was hidden in a dense forest, marked only by a rusted sign. Around them, the landscape seemed like an alien world, cloaked in desolation. Towering trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like skeletal sentinels, their bark blackened from distant fires. The ground was a mix of cracked earth and ash, crunching underfoot like brittle paper. The air carried an eerie stillness, interrupted only by the occasional creak of a dying tree or the faint howl of wind through the emptiness. The radioactive dust floated lazily, catching the faint light filtering through the gray, overcast sky. Every shadow seemed alive, every movement a potential threat as they approached the shelter's entrance. As they descended into the underground bunker, they were greeted by armed guards in hazmat suits, who scrutinized them before allowing them in. They stripped them of their clothes and belongings, and were promptly moved into a decontamination shower. Blake protested as the guards demanded he hand over the photograph of his wife and daughter. "This isn't just some object," he argued, his voice tight with emotion. "It's all I have left of them." The guard's tone was firm, but not unkind. "I understand, but it's contaminated. We can't risk bringing radioactive material into the shelter. I'm sorry." Blake's hands trembled as he reluctantly handed over the photo. The guard placed it into a sealed container marked with a radiation symbol. Watching it disappear felt like losing them all over again. The icy water of the decontamination shower did little to wash away the sting of that moment. The trio worked in silence, their bodies trembling from the cold and the weight of the situation. The guards barked orders through their hazmat suits, their voices muffled but firm. "Scrub thoroughly," Run instructed, shoving coarse brushes and soap into their hands. The water sprayed down in icy torrents, carrying away the ash and fallout that clung to their skin. They worked in silence, their bodies trembling from the cold and the weight of the situation. Rusty grumbled under his breath about the indignity, but even he knew this was necessary. After the shower, they were handed threadbare clothing and led to a sterile medical bay. Inside, a team of medics began a series of tests. Blood samples, radiation scans, and injections that left their arms sore. "You all have severe exposure," one medic said, her tone clinical. "We'll start treatment immediately, but you'll need to remain in quarantine for at least 2 weeks. Blake clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. 2 weeks? I don't have 2 weeks. I need to find my family." The medic glanced at him with tired eyes. "You won't do them any good if you're dead. The treatment requires time. If you want to survive, you'll stay." Charlie placed a hand on Blake's shoulder. "She's right. We're of no use to anyone in this condition," he said, with a raspy cough. Reluctantly, Blake nodded. His family was out there somewhere, but rushing off without recovering would only make the search impossible. They were then moved to a small recovery room, where they were given bland meals, hydration packs, and regular injections of anti-radiation medication and iodine pills. Over the weeks, the symptoms of their sickness began to subside, though their strength remained a shadow of what it once was. For 3 months they remained in the shelter. Blake threw himself into recovery, not for himself, but for the chance to find Emily and Clara. Each day was a grind of physical therapy, medical treatments, and restless nights. The absence of his family weighed heavy on him, but he kept reminding himself of his goal. "I'll find them," he whispered to himself nightly. "I have to." Inside, the shelter was a hive of activity. Survivors moved about, repairing equipment, distributing food, and tending to the sick. Blake and Charlie were given a corner to rest, but their relief was short-lived. The shelter was running out of supplies, and tensions among the survivors were high. Blake volunteered to join a scouting mission, and with that group, ventured back to the surface to scavenge, encountering mutated wildlife and desperate scavengers. Each mission they had became more dangerous, but Blake pushed on, driven by the hope of finding his family. Months passed in the shelter, each day blurring into the next as Blake, Charlie, and Rusty recovered and tried to adapt to their new lives underground. Blake spent hours helping repair damaged equipment and scavenged parts brought in by other teams. Charlie, with his quick wit and sharp eyes, took on a role in communication, often manning the radios to assist in contacting other shelters. Rusty, always with grease on his hands, had become invaluable in fixing the machinery that kept the shelter running: generators, water filters, and even ventilation systems. The shelter's radio was a lifeline. Its range was limited, but it connected survivors to a fragile network of bunkers scattered across the region. Charlie spent his nights tuning the dials, listening for any signs of loved ones. "Charlie, is that you?" His breath caught in his throat. "Katie?" he whispered, barely able to believe it. The voice on the other end faltered, emotional. It's me! I'm safe! I'm in a shelter west of Asheville!" Tears welled in Charlie's eyes as he gripped the microphone. "We'll find you," he promised. "We're coming, just hold on." The moment lit a fire under Charlie. Though his recovery was slow, the hope of reuniting with his sister gave him purpose and energy. His jokes returned, lighter than before, as he counted down the days until they could leave the shelter. Although they hadn't spoken much before the bombs fell, she was one of his lifelines to the old world. Rusty, though quieter about his past, often asked radio operators to keep an ear out for survivors from his hometown of Knoxville. Despite their banter, the hope of reconnecting with family drove both men forward. Blake's priority never wavered. He asked about Emily and Clara at every opportunity. One night, as the radio buzzed faintly in the corner, a voice broke through the static. "Emily McAllister, Clara McAllister, listed as survivors at the Chattanooga shelter." Blake's heart raced, his voice shaking as he grabbed the microphone. "This is Blake McAllister. Are they safe? Can I talk to them?" There was a pause, then a new voice spoke, a woman's, calm but firm. "They're safe, Mr. McAllister. Passing the line to them now." Seconds later, Emily's voice came through, fragile but alive. "Blake, is it really you?" "Emily, oh my God, Emily, it's me," he said, tears streaming down his face. And Clara? Is Clara okay?" "She's here. She's safe. We're safe," Emily replied, her voice breaking with relief. Blake clutched the microphone like a lifeline. "I'm coming for you. Hold tight." The voice crackled and went silent. But for the first time in months, Blake felt whole again. Blake seized on the lead, but he knew he couldn't rush into the unknown. His recovery had been hard-won, and the radiation still lingered in his body. "If I push too hard, I'll never make it to them," he admitted to Charlie one night, his voice heavy with frustration. "You're right," Charlie said. "We're all playing the long game now." The months dragged on. By the time they were cleared to leave the shelter for extended periods, winter had arrived. Snow, mingled with radioactive ash, blanketed the desolate landscape. Blake, Charlie, and Rusty prepared to leave, equipped with supplies, maps, and coordinates of other shelters. On their final day in the shelter, Blake stood by the radio room, watching as Charlie shared a quiet conversation with one of the operators. Rusty approached, carrying a patched-up backpack. "Time to get your suit on," Blake said quietly. Charlie nodded and donned the uncomfortable tarp-like suit. As Blake, Charlie, and Rusty exited the bunker for the final time, they were directed towards a massive armored school bus idling on the cracked earth. The old school bus had been turned into a beast, its heavy frame reinforced with steel plates, the windows replaced with thick wire mesh. A logo for the shelter system had been hastily painted on the side, though streaks of ash had dulled its color. Guards in hazmat suits waved the trio forward.
"All passengers load up. We're leaving in 10 minutes.
One of them shouted, his voice muffled behind his respirator. Blake hesitated at the truck's rear gate. While the truck certainly looked rough, the idea of seeing his family again made the risk more than worth it.
"Relax, McAllister. It's not the Daytona 500, but it'll get us there."
Rusty followed close behind, carrying their supplies in a vacuum-sealed bag.
"You sure this thing's gonna make it? Looks like it's held together with duct tape and prayers."
The guard nearest to them overheard and chuckled dryly.
She's ugly, but she's reliable. You'd be surprised how far these old buses can go."
Inside the bus, rows of survivors sat on bolted-down benches. The air was thick with tension, the faces of the other survivors barely visible under their gas masks. As the bus rumbled to life, Blake stared out the grated window, the ruined landscape rolling past. Rusty tapped his knee.
"You ready for this?"
Blake nodded, though his jaw was tight.
"I have to be."
The journey was long and jarring, the bus bouncing over craters and weaving through collapsed roads. Along the way, they passed through towns reduced to rubble and forests that looked more like graveyards. The radio crackled occasionally, offering updates on the convoy's progress and instructions for upcoming checkpoints. Charlie leaned back, his voice soft.
"Finally gonna see them again. My sister, your family, after everything, we're still here."
Blake didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon.
"Yeah,
He said eventually.
we're still here."
The bus lurched to a stop several hours later at a heavily guarded outpost. Survivors disembarked, blinking against the dim winter light. Guards directed them towards a processing area, where the final checks would be conducted before they were reunited with their families. Blake's heart pounded as he stepped onto solid ground, the weight of the journey finally catching up with him. The guards motioned for the survivors to move into the main hall of the shelter, where families were waiting. A low murmur of voices filled the room, rising into cries of joy as people recognized loved ones. Blake scanned the crowded space, his chest tightening with every step. Then, across the room, he saw them. Emily stood holding Clara's hand, but it was Clara who spotted him first, her small hand shooting up to point, "Daddy!" Blake didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance in long strides, dropping to his knees as Clara ran into his arms. "My girl," he whispered, his voice breaking as he held her tight. Emily followed, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around them both. "You found us," Emily said, her voice trembling. "You really found us." Blake pulled back just enough to look at them, his hands trembling as he touched their faces. "I never stopped looking," he said. "I told you I would find you." Nearby, Charlie was embracing his sister, both crying as they held each other close. Rusty stood quietly to the side, watching the reunions with a soft smile. One of the guards approached him. "Anyone you want us to check for?" the guard asked. Rusty hesitated, his smile faltering. "Not anymore. This is my family," he said softly. "But thanks." As the reunions continued, the shelter's overhead speakers announced the arrival of new survivors. The sound of hope filled the air as people clung to each other, their long journeys finally at an end. Blake held Emily and Clara close, feeling the weight of months of fear and loss finally lift. For the first time since the bombs fell, the world didn't feel entirely broken. "Together," he whispered, holding his family close. "We're gonna be okay." He turned to Charlie and Rusty, their faces weary but hopeful. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We made it." Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for more.